All right, hello everyone. I think we're ready to get started. We have a few people coming in. Grab a seat, get comfy. Thank you everyone for joining us at Coalesce. I hope everyone's having a good time. My name is Jillian. I lead the community advocacy team at DBT Labs, and I will be your host for today's session, The Missing Link, Design as a Daily Activity. And we will be joined by none other than my former colleague and friend, Ashley Sherwood. Ashley is a principal analytics engineer at HubSpot, and she also writes fantasy novels. And more importantly, we wanted to make sure that everyone knows that Ashley has a 100% win rate at shuffleboard.
Don't ask about the win volume.
Also, this isn't in my notes. See, I wasn't supposed to host this session, but Ashley was my partner in crime at HubSpot, and she is the reason that DBT is used at HubSpot today. Couldn't have done that without you. But a few notes before I bring Ashley up. All of the conversations will be in Slack. The Q&A will be in Slack in the channel Coalesce, The Missing Link, and that will, keeping everything in Slack, lets our online audience join in from around the globe. If you're not part of the Slack, you can join now at community.getdbt.com. Coalesce, The Missing Link is the channel. And that's it. Let's make some noise for Ashley, everyone.
Thank you, Jill. Great to see you all here today. I'm really excited to share about this topic, and chances are you're here because you've asked the question, what does it mean to be technical? Am I technical enough? How do I get more technical? I want to be a good engineer. What does that mean? It's really easy to get distracted and bogged down by the alphabets, by the SQL and the Python and the R and the CI/CD. And at a conference like Coalesce, where everybody is telling you about the cool new technology, it's really easy to feel like you're falling behind, that maybe you're not such a good engineer because you don't know what Kimball is, and that's like a whole session about why it's old news. Why I want to share this talk with you is that being an excellent engineer isn't actually about the alphabets, it's about something else. And if you have imposter syndrome, this something else might give you a little bit more confidence that you're on the right track, or a prompt, an opportunity to maybe change the track you're on and double down on something you didn't think was relevant. But before we get into that, I want to share a little bit more about myself, which is mostly an excuse to share pictures of my pets. So I have two cats, Maple and Pancake. Maple's in my Twitter profile picture. She's a little Torby cat, so she's like a black and gray tabby. Then I have Pancake, a very grumpy and silly black cat, and also a literal python whose name is Cinnamon. Yes, there is a breakfast food theme. We live in Boston, Massachusetts. I've worked at HubSpot for about 4 years now, and like Jillian said, have been so excited to be on the journey of adopting DBT and really leveling up HubSpot and our technical data stack. My background's engineering, but I've always had a million hobbies, and weirdly that's made me a better engineer, which was kind of the inspiration for this whole thing. So the first question I have for you all today is, have you thought this before? We have data, then something, then profit. But to make it a little more real, to bring it a little closer to home for the analytics engineers, the ML engineers, and the data analysts in the room, oftentimes it looks like this. Use case, then something, then code that does the thing. We know that the final output we're responsible for is production code shipped in a repo, running on a schedule. But what takes us from use case to that code actually doing the thing, and how do we know that thing is actually useful? What is that missing link? It's actually design. So if you're here today as an individual contributor, what you're going to get out of this is an ability to grow your technical career, maybe in a way that you didn't expect. Now, if you're a manager of data teams or somebody who's data adjacent, you'll also get the opportunity to grow your team and make sure that you're making space for the skills that have an impact, which is more important than ever. So when we try to think about how to find someone technical for the team, how to grow the technical skills on the team, a lot of times the job recs can look like this. Here we have the meme where you could continue on the interstate that says systems design skills, but you've aggressively decided to take the exit that says SQL expert. Anytime somebody hands me a job rec that has SQL expert in it, I know that I have a lot of editing to do, because what does that even mean? Do you want somebody who understands the infrastructure of a columnar database? Do you want somebody that can write a case statement without help? Almost nobody knows what they mean when they say they want a SQL expert. And how will a SQL expert actually help you? That's often not the right skill set to focus on. And if you haven't figured out by now, day 3, 2 at Coalesce, time's all running together for me. Analytics engineering is basically powered by metaphors. And today's metaphor du jour is data, but make it fashion. So the premise of this talk, the inspiration to frame it this way, came from my experience watching Netflix, Next in Fashion. This is a great show. I will spoil it. I'm sorry. It's still worth watching if you enjoy fashion or if you're just like, how in the world did somebody turn this Netflix show into a Coalesce talk? You'll have some firsthand data. So the premise of the show is we start with a bunch of designers who come on. They work in pairs, and they are going to go through an elimination type contest. They'll be judged every week. The worst teams are let go until finally only one designer will be left, and they will be dubbed Next in Fashion. I'm going to start by going a little bit further into the premise of the show, and I want you to stay tuned to see if any of these things feel like patterns you've seen before. So first, every episode starts with a broad, vague prompt. I'm going to pick the episode from which my favorite garment came and show you kind of how this process worked for the designers on the show. So for this episode, the prompt was denim. It's incredibly vague. Denim, make it next in fashion. That's all you get. And for many of us who are working with business stakeholders, that often feels like all we get. Make our profits better. Fix this broken thing. It's very vague and aspirational. So the first thing that a designer has to do on the show is creative ideation. They make a lot of sketches, they're working out, they're choosing how to approach the prompt from a lot of different options. They're using their own sensibilities and skills to ensure that the design that they create is innovative, memorable, but also realistic. At the end of the day, these looks have to walk the runway. Then they're going to go into the design phase, actually figuring out what to do with the details. They're going to figure out what tools, techniques, and materials they're going to use to create the look. In this example, the designer's name is Daniel, and with the denim prompt, he's chosen to use everybody else's denim scraps to make a dress that depicts an Arctic scene, commenting on waste in fashion, global warming, and the loss of our Arctic spaces. This is why this is my favorite look in the show, because the way that he approached this prompt was so compelling. Next is actually fabricating the look. You don't just get to draw it, you have to sew it, and you only have a certain amount of time to sew it, and then it has to actually go on the runway. And for this particular design, there were elements that couldn't be planned ahead. They had to work as they were at the sewing machine to decide how to put these different pieces together to make the Arctic scene. There was only so much that could be planned ahead of time, and a lot of it was figured out during the fabrication process. Finally, the models walk the runway. This is the ultimate test of each garment's look and feel in use. Judges provide their critique, and then it's on to the next prompt. One of the things that was really cool here is Tommy Hilfiger actually judged this part of the contest, and he was able to really pick out and appreciate the craftsmanship of this look, the difficulty of sewing these organic lines, the exceptional fit of the dress. Experts, other good designers, really can see what makes somebody else's work good, even if a layperson can't. What jumped out at me as I watched this show was how familiar this process felt. For example, we often start with a use case, a business need, a user story. We then go about imagining potential user experiences. How could we solve this? Will it be a spreadsheet, a report, an email? What tools could we use to solve this? What methods are available to us? Then we're designing a process or data solution. Once we've decided how to approach this vague prompt, we have to actually commit to the tools that we're going to use and design the solution. Then is implementing it. This is actually writing the code, making the PR, going through the review process. It's really only this step 3 fabrication that gets a lot of attention in terms of what an engineer does with their time. Finally is delivery. And ideally, your users are going to report on the effectiveness and tell you, did you do a good job or not? Did your look fall apart when it ran the runway? Was your dashboard actually useful? So that takes us to today's first of 4 lessons that we can learn about design from the world of fashion, which is saying an engineer creates code is like saying a fashion designer creates stitches. Technically correct, but woefully incomplete. Design skills are that other big piece. So to understand this better, let's look at that design process again. Prompt, creative ideation, design, fabrication, delivery. It looks nice and linear, right? Except it is not. For example, a fashion designer might find when they get to the fabrication step that the fabric they had chosen for their design is too heavy to lay in the way that they had expected. So they have to go back and change their design, either changing their construction technique to use the same material, or choosing a different material to get the effect they'd originally imagined. This is really also common in our implementation of data solutions. We may find that we are ready to launch something, and there's actually a crucial piece that requires user input, and our BI tool, where we decided to put the solution, doesn't take user input. So now we have to go back to the design step and change our solution to make sure that we are collecting that user input in an effective way. Just to make things even more fun, you don't just go back from fabrication to design. Design might take you all the way back to creative ideation. For example, the entire premise of a data project you're working on might be that sales reps are going to manually tell you which deals are most likely to close. But if they just don't have time in their day to do that, you might have to go back to the business and come up with a completely different way to interpret their prompt of improved deal close rates. We will end up cycling through these steps of ideation, design, and fabrication many, many times during the implementation process, which can make it really hard to tell the differences between these steps. They are always happening, but we often take them for granted because they tend to blur together. Using a concrete example like fashion design, where the fabrication is physical and the sketches are tangible, makes it a little bit easier for us to tease apart the differences in these activities and better understand how they apply to our own engineering practices. And that takes us to our second lesson. Ideation, design, and fabrication are iterative activities, not steps. These graphics come from a book by Jeff Conklin talking about wicked problems, which I highly recommend and which was shared with me by Jill. On the left, we see a traditional understanding of how to solve a problem. We gather data, we analyze data, we formulate a solution, and then we implement it. That's what we're all trying to do, right? Except if you take the best problem solvers, the experts, and you watch them solve a complex problem, they don't follow the red line, they follow the green line. They will oscillate rapidly between problem and solution. This is really important to understand because if you resist this part of the process, you will actually hamstring your ability to solve complex problems. Engineers will be told they're solutionizing too early, we'll have locked in resources and budgets too early in the project and find at the end that we can't pivot the way that we need to. Simple problems you can waterfall, sure. Things that have heavy compliance requirements, yes, you have to waterfall. But the complex, interesting, compelling business problems where data teams are poised to provide the greatest value often look like the graph on the right. And embracing that process is going to improve your efficacy as an engineer, and making space for that process is going to improve the efficacy of your team of engineers. So how can we better understand these activities, how they're done, and who does them? We can take a look at each of these activities and what it looks like to do them at novice and expert levels, and what kind of projects have these different profiles. So I'm going to start with a couple of examples from sewing to keep it concrete, and then we're going to abstract up to what this looks like for engineering. Our first example is the tote bag with a cute cat on the front. This is a black cat reading a book that says world domination. If someone says to you, make me a tote bag, that request is concrete and specific. We have a shared understanding of what a tote bag is, about what size it is, and what it's going to do. Furthermore, the design of that tote bag is simple, and there are ample examples. You can find hundreds of different patterns for how to make a tote bag just by Googling tote bag pattern. Once you have that pattern in hand that someone else has determined for you, or even that you made yourself, because again, it's a few rectangles, you can probably derive that on your own, you need to fabricate it. And actually sewing a tote bag is also really easy and well documented. Almost any sewing machine can handle it. You don't need fancy tools. You don't need advanced skills. Your first tote bag won't be perfect, but I bet everybody in this room could make a great tote bag in about 3 tries. Contrast that to the winning garment for Next in Fashion. So this is where I said I was going to spoil it, but I wanted to share this example. The prompt for this garment was, make a wedding dress that's next in fashion. What the designer came up with was this really clever design where the wedding dress starts in sort of this tent-like structure around the face, and then it sort of expands into a veil, and then the veil comes off and becomes a train behind. It's really cool and worth watching the finale just to see this thing in action. I was not advanced enough to get a GIF in the presentation for you guys, but it's really cool. So when we think about a design like this, the prompt was vague and aspirational. Wedding dress, make it next in fashion, like what does that even mean? Next, the actual design of it is complex and bespoke. There is not a pattern at Joann's Fabric for how to make this kind of dress. It had to be designed completely custom from the ground up. And finally, once it was designed, fabricating it was not easy either. This is lace and organza, and if you've ever done any sewing, you know that those are some of the worst and most difficult materials to use. Doing this and doing it cleanly requires exceptional technical skill as a sewer. On all 3 dimensions, pulling this design off required a senior expert designer. Let's start to think about some business problems and how this might apply to things that are a little closer to home. Take net new ARR, for example. This is a common software as a service metric that has a shared understanding across companies. So when somebody says, make me a net new ARR report, that request is concrete and specific. There's a shared understanding of what that means. The design is where it gets a little bit interesting. Net new ARR uses concepts like expansion and contraction, but depending on your billing system, it might not initially be obvious which transactions are expansions or contractions. For example, the HubSpot product has a variety of product tiers going starter, pro, and enterprise. The way that our system works, if you upgrade from pro to enterprise, that's the business meaning of what's happening, you actually churn a starter subscription or a pro subscription and purchase an enterprise subscription. So interpreting the transactions from the database requires good design so that we can be confident that we are representing upgrades as upgrades, downgrades as downgrades, cancels as cancels, and currency conversions, my favorite type of MRR change, as currency conversions and not as discount changes. That design is challenging, and that's why we needed more complex and bespoke design for our net new ARR metric than another company might have needed. We had a complex subscription platform, so we needed senior people to make good design decisions about how we were going to interpret the transactions from our database. Once those decisions were made, the actual SQL required to implement them was only intermediate. If you had a good understanding of grain, foreign keys, and window functions, you would be able to easily comprehend what's going on in the actual code base that feeds our net new ARR metric. But the design was the hard part, and that's why we needed a senior engineer on the project. Here's another example on the opposite side of the prompt spectrum, a vague and aspirational request, improve our profit margin. There are so many different ways to interpret that prompt, so many different ways to turn that goal into an actual design that can be implemented. So interpreting that vague prompt requires a talented designer. Not only that, but usually what you'll come up with also requires something complex and bespoke. If you're a particularly small business in a well-defined area, you might find a lot of good examples of how to improve profitability, but you probably won't find any external guide that's going to tell you what is the next right step for your company right now. So that design can become challenging. But again, on the fabrication, this is an example where sometimes deciding what to do can be the hard part. Unless what you need to do is big data and a very complex system, you probably don't need to be the world's best SQL writer to implement the design that's going to help improve your bottom line profitability. But that design had better be good, or else you're not going to move the needle. So that takes us to our third lesson. Design can compensate for poor fabrication, but fabrication can't fix poor design. I'm going to have to explain these visuals. So on the left, we have a garment. It's a dress. It can be worn 8 different ways, and they all look good. Not only that, but this is such a clever design that a beginner sewer can approach it. If your stitching is a little shaky, If you aren't very confident, you can still pull this off, and it's a great beginner project. The design is so good that it can make up for poor fabrication. You're not going to notice a loose thread if somebody's wearing that to a party. You're going to be like, that's fun, good job. You made that, amazing. On the right, we have a garment that is actually very well executed. It's a knit sweater with a Santa Claus design on the front. I have crocheted. I know a lot of knitters. This is very well done. There's great color work. That is hard. There are no loose threads. There's appliques on top and gemstones. That's advanced. That's difficult to pull off, technically. However, no matter how perfect those stitches are, nothing is going to stop this image of Santa Claus from haunting your dreams. Because the design includes dead eyes and this horrifying black hole mouth. So we can see how excellent design can make up for some shaky fabrication, but no amount of fabrication perfection can make up for a horrific design. So what this leads us to is a conclusion, which is that advancing design skills will take you further faster than advanced syntax details, especially in the context of making organizational improvements and realizing value from data at your company. So with that in mind, how can we make sure that we end up with a strong design and not a horrifying one, even if that horrifying one is executed well? Let's go back to our 3 parts of this process and think about how we could structure teams to approach this. I'm going to frame this up in sort of the context of a small company with a small number of engineers working in a very boutique way, much like the fashion designers in Next in Fashion, where each one-person shops doing bespoke boutique design, not at a large scale. This doesn't mean that your company isn't large-scaled. It just means that the problems that you're solving are relatively unique, relatively complex, and you don't have a really clear playbook to work from of exactly what the right thing to do next is. You may have a lot of inspiration, but it's still up to you to interpret it. The simplest way to design a team in this context is to have one person do all of this. One of the great benefits of this is that those iterations of design that we saw, that green graph that was bouncing up and down, this can all happen in one brain. That's incredibly powerful in terms of having those iterations happen fluidly. What this means for an individual engineer is that often we need to give them more access to stakeholders, have them receive the creative prompt directly, let them decide how it should be interpreted. This is kind of breaking that model of a product owner saying, okay, we need to make an automation that makes sales reps click this button faster. You're like, okay, wait, no, but why? It's getting engineers directly into the why conversation so that they can help come up with creative solutions to true business pain, not just respond to project requests. It also means those engineers own the approach and design, which sometimes means getting the freedom to make mistakes and learn from them. And it means that you get a lot of benefit from having the people doing the design also do the execution. When you need to scale, and you've thought in this way, it just looks like adding a second person that does this whole thing. A lot of the teams on Next in Fashion worked this way. They had 2 different designers. They would come to an agreement on how they were going to approach the prompt, and then they would each tackle the design and execution process for their own garment. 2 garments per round, 2 designers. They were able to parallelize really powerfully. The biggest risk of this approach is that you don't actually have a cohesive design at the end. The 2 things look like 2 different people made them because that's what happened. In design, that's a big problem, like in fashion design, because it's got to look good and go together. But in engineering, it's not as big of a problem. You might have a few different styles and flavors sitting in your code base, but as long as everything's readable, as long as things are close enough, that risk isn't too untenable. Another common way of approaching this is to have more of a product manager or project owner and have them pass off to engineers kind of at this design step. So what happens here? Well, if you're doing it well, you have this really powerful design iteration that's happening in this overlap. Your product manager and your engineer are in lockstep trying to come up with that design, or maybe they're iterating separately, but they get onto the same page. If this handoff is really strong, if you're making space for these rapid iterations that happen over and over again, then this is going to go really well for you. However, if you don't do this well, if you try to hand things over a wall, you're going to end up with work that's ineffective, Or your engineers are going to be taking on a lot of shadow design work. They are going to be doing creative ideation, design, and fabrication, all without access to the stakeholder, all without access to the original story. And when that happens, you're going to have people that feel underappreciated. So nailing this interface is important for those people feeling like they're getting credit for what they're doing, feeling like most of their design isn't glue work, and for having that team really get along well. A breakdown here is really common. If you are not managing that interface well, if you're not letting that iteration happen, if you're trying to force things into a waterfall with handoffs between teams, then you are going to be in a rough spot. Another risk of this approach, even if that interface is strong, is a bottleneck in actual fabrication. So if you have hired 2 people, and one of those people is great at creative ideation, and one of those people is great at design and execution, it's actually how one of the teams on Next in Fashion worked. They did make some incredible garments working together because they could get the best of both worlds. But where they really struggled were the time constraints, because you are just physically limited by only having 2 hand sewing instead of having 4 hand sewing. And that can also happen in your data solutions. You may have great handoffs and make good products, but you might find yourself limited by trying to push analytics engineers to the end of this process and product managers to the beginning, as opposed to letting those analytics engineers, ML engineers, analysts, et cetera, actually own that whole process and parallelize. So the scalability that comes from sequencing work can also become a bottleneck, and you have to manage that carefully. So that takes us to lesson 4. Analytics designers are the best at tackling complex problems. Now, this is not a new job title, just a different way about thinking of those activities that comprise being an analytics engineer. Nailing this effective cascade model is hard, but so is finding and training analytics designers, analytics engineers with a strong design skill set. So one of the best things that you can do as a practical takeaway is to ask yourself, do I have any of these today? Do I have analytics designers who are begging to be in stakeholder conversations, who are trying to make decisions and demonstrate ownership and solve complex problems? If you do, recognizing the work that they're doing and making space for it is going to make a massive difference in retaining that person and helping to recruit other people like them. So that's the first practical thing you can do, is figure out, are you one of these? Now you have a way of advocating for yourself, a language that you can leverage. Do you have one of these or more of these on your team? Now you have a language for making space for these design activities and demonstrating the value that you'll get out of them beyond just time spent typing in code. What's most important here is that this is crucial when you have complex problems. If you have repeatable problems, simple problems, things that are well documented, you might get a lot of scaling out of that cascade because you can have one product manager and 5 or 6 junior engineers. But if you're at a point where everything that you need to implement requires advanced fabrication, or every project that lands on your plate is inherently a complex design, that's where thinking across this entire design process is going to bring you the most value. Overall, you just need to think hard about what's the best fit for your company and the skills on your team. There is so much more to unpack in this metaphor than we have time for today. So I'm going to leave us with a few loose threads to pull on, so to speak. And I would love for you to share your thoughts, questions, curiosities about any of these comments or topics in the Slack channel. So we can think about things like boutique versus mass-produced. I was focusing on boutique today, but like I sort of teased with simpler problems, what does it look like to have, like in the case of a lot of mass-produced fashion, great designers making a garment and then a whole bunch of people executing them at scale? That's a different model. So from there, we can think about reproducible patterns and outsourcing. We can also think about what it means to be an innovative-first company, a brand-first company, or fast fashion, which asks questions about time to delivery and cargo cult dynamics. That's a really fun one to Google. We can also think about user experience, trendiness versus function, and cost to acquire versus durability. These are all really interesting things to try to translate into the world of data analytics and data operations. If you would love to continue this conversation with me even outside of Coalesce, you can find me on Twitter at CompilerQueen, and on Substack, compilerqueen.substack.com. There will be a part 2 to this, which will get into the detail of what are the component skills of design, how can you measure them. There will be behavioral questions that I've used in interviews to assess those skills from prospects. You can use them to gauge yourself, you can use them to gauge your team, to explore places you want to double click on. That will be coming soon, so if you subscribe or join within the week, you'll get that, and it's free to join anytime, so you can get that anyway as well. So before I leave off with you all, I want to go back over those 4 lessons again, and you'll get a nice photoable set of all 4 on the slide for you before we walk away. So first, code is only part of being technical. Saying an engineer creates code is like saying a designer creates stitches. Technically correct, but woefully incomplete. 2, complex problems need fluid iteration. Ideation, design, and fabrication are iterative activities, not waterfall steps. 3, design trumps fabrication. Design can compensate for poor fabrication, but fabrication cannot compensate for poor design. And finally, 4, a great engineer is actually a great designer. Analytics designers are the best at tackling complex problems. If you want to gain more confidence in what it means to be a technical person, if you want to win better outcomes at your company through your technical skill, focus first on being a great designer, on choosing good tools at good times and good practices in the right context. Notice I don't say best anywhere, because nothing is ever truly best. The greatest skill that you can develop is getting that sense of what's good enough, what works well enough and keeps our velocity high. Those skills are going to take you a lot farther and a lot faster in your technical career than how many alphabet soup words you can put in your LinkedIn profile. Thank you all so much for joining me today in person and online, and I'm super excited to continue this conversation with you on Slack immediately after and then indefinitely into the future.